clear the trash.
What? What was that?
I'd make sure they were gonna do it.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. It is the second part of my Battle for Azeroth critique today. Now in the previous video I talked about the more pressing immediate issues that the expansion faces. Now that's fine, and I think it's good to understand the immediate things, but I think we can go a lot deeper than just the immediate systems, so we can really touch on the fundamental design philosophies that those systems follow through on.
We've been waiting for this.
That's our goal today.
Good.
Now World of Warcraft, as time has went on, has had a increasingly more directed progression. In vanilla, progression was a bit of a mess. It just happened to be a mess that players sort of enjoyed working out for themselves.
True.
And because of that, it was decently freeform.
Yes.
Now as we move on to the Burning Crusade, we see the introduction of things like badge gear, and as time would press on, you know, past that, moving from expansion to expansion, we saw increasingly more directed progression in the game. As an example, say gearing. Now what do I mean by directed? Well, essentially that your fate is something that is increasingly a little bit more planned, estimated, and accounted for in the design stages of the game. Now, to be very clear, for the most part, that is a good thing. Now,
that's great.
You know, it became more of an element of the game as times went on, and then, of course, Legion came around, and it essentially rewrote the book on World of Warcraft systems. So today, we're going to talk about the philosophical underpinnings of Battle for Azeroth's progression systems, how that stuff is all designed, and how I suspect there is a bit of a core problem that is underlying a lot of the criticism of modern World of Warcraft. Now, this is one of those videos where I can't really front-load the punchline. It's the type of thing that makes a lot more sense by the end, so let's just get stuck in. Okay, the modern game is heavily dictated by large progression systems, primarily artifact power and the Azerite gear that interacts with it. Now, the direct specific problems of the BFA incarnations of these ideas were covered in the previous video, but today it is about the design philosophy that has led to those systems. Now, as I do this, I'm about to travel to EGX for 5 days for my game development work, so we are switching over to a bit of a faster edit, so yeah, I'm going to pop off to the corner of the screen now. Okay, World of Warcraft has a lot of content across many playstyles. Loads of dungeons, a big raid, 6 whole zones, hundreds of quests, and yet for some reason Battle for Azeroth, I would contend, feels very small. So why is that? Well, we need to talk about the homogenizing effect that overarching systems can have on content. So, if a bit of content has got to fit in the context of a larger system, then it can only be so unique. Why is that? Well, if it's too crazy, it doesn't fit the system. Either it will be so different that it feels out of place, or it will be unbalanced in terms of its rewards. Content within a system has to be vaguely comparable in terms of its rate of reward to other bits of content within that system, because if that's not the case, then the scope of the system is reduced even more because all players will tunnel into the one really efficient bit of content within that system.
True.
Now this limits designers, but it also provides safe bounds to work within, such that adding additional content to a system isn't that hard. If Mythic Plus exists, then adding a new dungeon into that mold is pretty easy. Adding another quest into the World Quest pool is pretty easy. The same goes for another Azerite trade, another Heart of Azeroth level. Within each of these systems, there are
how about the whole system together?
The
whole entire thing.
Getting and the content style. So when most of the game's content fits within a few overarching systems that define the end game, then you run the risk of the content feeling rather homogenized. World quests are a great example of this. Doing world quests in Battle for Azeroth feels the same as doing world quests in Legion.
Except for it sucks and it takes longer.
Themselves. Now, why is this? Well, they've got a similar duration, they've got a similar style, and they've got a similar reward. A handy point of comparison is regular quests. By being less fixed and more freeform in design, the regular quest system can really support a lot more variety, including standout quests like, say, Crusader Bridenbard, which are totally different. So, these systems place bounds on how out there bits of content can be. Now, where this begins to be more of a problem is the overarching reward systems of the game, because these systems control everything, and almost all of the endgame content exists within them. Now, the current endgame is dominated by artifact power, meaning that you constantly have one almost unreachable goal that's really just out of grasp all the time, and that is essentially the core of the endgame progression. Now, between that and item level, you're basically just chasing 2 different carrots, and that's the entirety of the endgame of WoW. It's all set up to support that loop. Now, what's the upside of this? Well, it means that the wealth of endgame content is contextualized within the scope of these 2 reward loops. Now, I believe that this has a very limiting effect on the game, both in terms of rewards, so the reason why you do the content, and the gameplay of the content itself, and that means that the scope of experiences in the game is reduced. Now, this means that it makes the world feel very small, and I would contend that you could add 2 more continents of world quests, another 1,000 world quests, 15 dungeons, add another Warfront, and you'd still have a gameplay experience that essentially feels unchanged and would not be exciting. Why? Well, the systems are the same. Now, you see, these systems, by being so solid and rigid in their progression and content requirements, they have severely limited player freedom and expression within the game. Taking the most absurd example from Battle for Azeroth, you cannot spend conquest points in a vendor now. No, you have to follow through Blizzard's pre-planned gearing path. What if you want to dabble in PvP to earn some conquest points to grab an item from the vendor that you like to fill in your regular gear set?
Of course.
Unfortunately, that is outside of the scope of Blizzard's pre-planned path for you, so you cannot do it. This was not the case in the past. Why did Blizzard make PvP gear operate in this manner? Well, thankfully, they told us. They said that they wanted it to be on the UI so that it was not confusing to players, and they said that they did not want players to choose a suboptimal bit of gear with their currency. Well, the former point turned out not to be true, and the latter point completely ignores the content of an individual player's experience of playing the game. So, for a hardcore PvP player, sure, there may be a suboptimal decision there that could be made. But for a raider or a casual player who wants to fill in their, like maybe a gear slot, well, that's not a suboptimal decision. Now, this principle can be broadly applied across the reward systems of World of Warcraft.
True.
Blizzard have taken very tight control over your character's progress. They have done this in the name of creating a more streamlined system with less room for player error and ostensibly an easier onboarding experience for new players. Are those good intentions? I do think they are good intentions. I think the devs mean well. However, the effects are anything but good as they invalidate your individual expression. How you want to play the game, what gear you want to target, how you want to do things. Now, what's almost worse is that these systems, you know, they almost always have the opposite of their intended effect. Now, remember how Azerite gear was supposed to simplify artifacts, sets, and legendaries together? Well, I think almost anyone who engages in that system to near its maximum sort of potential, you know that it is not more simple. You're juggling those 3 bits of gear, each with their own talent tree. Each one is spec specific. It's a bit more complex than just selecting, which 2 of my legendaries in my bag do I want to use? So as you can see, it damages the game's core reward loop by removing you from the equation and setting you on more of a pre-planned path. Now, we started this video talking about content design, and I think we need to sort of go back to that. If the content of an expansion has to work within the context of a number of expansion-wide systems, then it leads to additive design rather than multiplicative design. To explain this quite simply, if you have 3 systems that are multiplicative in regards to each other, then you kind of have, as a thought experiment, you could say you've kind of got like 3 squared things, right? Well, if you've got 3 things that are additive, well, you've just got 3 things. Now, if the game is dictated by large and flexible systems, then adding content that's multiplicative in nature or systems that are multiplicative is challenging because the effects are tremendous. Now, this damages the developer's ability to dabble in daring types of content that lead to genuine innovation. And then if large systems can exist between expansions, then it hurts their ability to innovate between expansions, which I think is something the Battle for Azeroth really shows us. So instead we get very additive systems like Warfronts and Island Expeditions, which are bolt-ons. Ultimately, they are slaves to things that are greater than themselves. Expeditions are a slave to artifact power, which imposes a bunch of restrictions on what expeditions can be. They have to have a certain amount of AP per hour in order to compete. Now,
I agree with everything.
Part of the main progression of the expansion.
This is a very good video.
Doable by everyone. They have to target everyone, and this means that in design they're not really that risky, and they don't feel unique. The designers at Blizzard don't actually have the freedom to create the ultimate expression of the fantasy of exploring an uncharted island because it needs to fit within the existing artifact power system, which itself is a holdover from the previous expansion. Then take Warfronts. They're nearly impossible to lose, and they take 20 minutes. Like Island Expeditions, they need to be doable by just about anyone, with a pretty low, amount of time required. They don't really feel that unique to play, even though they literally are very unique within WoW. Why don't they feel special? Well, once again, they are constrained in their scope by the need to fit a system that is kind of beyond that scope. And what do I mean when I say scope? I suppose I kind of mean the scope of the activity that you're doing, exploring an island, sieging a castle, Warfronts and Island Expeditions feel like knockoff B-movie versions of those fantasies. Let's do a really extreme example. Old school Alterac Valley. It took hours. It was really epic, and it truly was unique. Now, was it for everyone? No. No, it was not. Was it sure as hell for some people? Yes. And I think it's better to have 1,000 true fans than 10,000 fair-weather visitors. What happened to Alterac Valley when it had to fit the expectations of the Battleground system? Almost all of its unique mechanics were rendered null and void. And what made it special was lost. Was it less offensive? Yes. Was it less unique and loved? I'd say yes.
Can you what?
Now, that's a very extreme example to prove my point.
You really need to figure out how to fix that.
That really has been applying to much of the content in-game. Blizzard have traded in having daring and innovative content for stuff that's kind of inoffensive and efficient. Now, these large systems felt daring and fun in Legion because they were new. They were part of a big change of pace for the game. That felt awesome. However, as we move into BFA, by sticking firmly to them, we have a game that feels pretty familiar, pretty similar in nature. It doesn't take risks. And this is how I believe a game with factually a large amount of content can feel small to players. Now, the final thing that I want to add in is that the creative side activities of Legion, like the Withered scenario and the Hole of Suramar, they don't have equivalents in BFA. Now, having the core of the progression of the game being dictated by some of these big, heavy systems, that actually can work, but it really does rely on having a variety of side activities to help out. Battle for Azeroth is probably hurt by not really having those side activities to mitigate the overbearing nature of the core progression of the endgame. So look, I understand that while, I'm not shouting and screaming here, what I'm saying when you actually get into it is really damning. I think it's worth pointing out, I still love Mythic Dungeons. I still love knocking out a bunch of
he's making a lot of really good points here.
Gameplay can be fun, but I think that, I'm taking a lot of enjoyment out of the gameplay, but when I kind of zoom out to think about the big systems, I worry about the player experience and the future direction of the game. So, I would love to hear what your take on my take is. I would also just like to know, completely free from what I've said here, what do you think about the sort of, I guess, deeper, less immediate pressing issues that the expansion maybe faces. So yeah, a massive thank you to you for watching. A big thank you to everyone over on Patreon. Of course, on Patreon, we've got these guys. These are pretty awesome. These are on the master tier, and yeah, you'll get these shipped to you every month. They're pretty sweet, and the Patreon crew has been instrumental in our new office, the new recording setup, which is why this looks a little bit better, and you'll see exciting things from that in the future. So thank you for everything, and I will see you next time.
So
I need to support him.
Yeah, I do feel like I want to support him for that, because that's actually honestly, that video is so big, and it's so what he's saying actually is something really, really big, right? So you should support Bellular if you want to, if you like his content. Whenever he actually makes videos that are analytical in that way, I always really enjoy them. So the reason that am I not subbed on my second account? Oh, I'm not. Okay, let me just sub to him. So the reason that I feel like they're so important is because he's talking about something that's a very, very broad issue that affects basically every single player in the game, right? What he's saying is that Blizzard doesn't want to take any risks. Blizzard doesn't want to do anything that steps outside the bounds because they're worried about that different activity eclipsing everything else. And also, Warfronts and Island Expeditions are only created in the context of the reward system, so they're not able to be freeform and as rewarding and fun as they could be. What he's saying is completely true, and it's a big problem that WoW has had, and I totally agree with it.